Anyway, thank you very much, folks, for coming to our lecture today on the social impact of prohibition. And in fact, it's almost, well, I guess three-part or three series of events today happening in that after the 420 at 4:30, there's also a meeting put on by the Harm Reduction Club, or the Harmless Club, I should say. I'd only heard of them last week, and there's a teach-in at the sub-building at 4:30. And while we might not make it there when it starts, we certainly hope to have a little contingency from the 420 go and see what's happening and see if there's any way we can help out with that group. So it's encouraging to know that there's other groups forming with different agendas and directions to dismantle this war on drugs, because while I'm a cannabis activist for the most part, it's really, or there are many changes that I'd like to help society with. Anyway, and so the war on drugs as a whole causes vast problems in society, but how to dismantle and sort of change from prohibition is very hard to imagine. And there's a lot of different social impacts of prohibition. Like I could talk for half an hour just on the prohibition of cannabis. In the past lectures, I've focused on a lot of the socio-economic impacts, political impacts. For example, just recently, someone within the old government of Mexico, there was a government that controlled Mexico for about 3 decades, and it's become apparent now that they were very involved in some of the drug cartels in Mexico. They couldn't be involved in all of them. That's why they're at war, because they're fighting over turf and stuff. But governments around the world have been and are very heavily influenced by people in the drug trade. And so there's extreme examples of the sort of political, social impacts going from down in South America, where you have countries like Colombia would be the worst that's been ripped apart by people fighting, paramilitary groups that are aligned with the government that are producing and selling cocaine in some regions, and in other regions, anti-government sort of forces would be growing and producing cocaine and using the resources for their communities. And so Colombia is certainly the worst. I understand just this week there's another mass kidnapping of like 25 people that are again involved in this war that is being fueled very much by money from cocaine. And so we could go through Central and South America. And other countries certainly affected include Bolivia, where I understand the current president was the sort of president of the Cocoa Farmers Association, where in I think it was Bolivia. I better be correct about that. Anyway, the traditional use of the plant was not what we see today in Western society. The traditional uses of the plant would be to chew it, to make it into tea, to make it into soaps and foods, and it's actually been through prohibition that we've refined the drug out of the plant, and so it's been something where the problems have been created by prohibition. There were no drug problems in these parts of the world before prohibition came about, because people were using, for the most part, plants to help themselves heal and for recreational and spiritual purposes. And so it's prohibition that has really caused problems, again, politically within these countries. But I bring up Bolivia because, again, there's been this kind of almost revolution in the country where now the president of the farmers of the plant has taken over, and I think they've kicked the DEA out of the country, and as far as I know, prohibition really isn't being enforced in that country anymore. I guess I could say that the socio-economic impacts are vast. You know, you can go and talk about Afghanistan right now, where I think, you know, through the media, most of us are well too aware of how drugs have been used, or the sale of opium and hash to forward military goals on all sorts of sides. It's sort of not as if just one community of people are doing this. In very poor regions of the country, in some of the poorest regions, there's a great incentive to grow and produce opium, and grow poppies for opium, and cocaine with the cocoa plant. In fact, the more impoverished a community is, the more likely they are to get involved into the drug trade. It's the most profitable business out there, and again, because of prohibition. So there's several countries like Afghanistan that are at a perpetual war over this. And you know, even internally, like within first world countries that don't look like they're at war, the civil war is intense. I'm not going to throw a lot of statistics at you. Statistics can be skewed and argued all sorts of ways. The two stats, though, I've put on the board are fairly well recognized and hard to argue against. That on one hand, the United States has about 4% of the world's population. There maybe are a few states that are harder when it comes to enforcing the drug war. But the fact that 25% of the world's prisoner population is in the United States, and you know, is a sign, I think, of how badly, you know, these policies have failed. And so I'm going to try to direct the rest of the class to some of the health impacts of prohibition. Okay? I can really talk a lot about the sort of socio-economic impacts. They're vast, you know, from drug testing and kids being kicked out of school because they smoked a joint, or can't get a job or travel because of a simple arrest, and the effect on families, the effect on the criminal justice system. Like, honestly, I could spend a half an hour on several areas of our lives that are affected, and I'd like to spend most of today, I get 20 minutes, on some of the healthcare impacts, because, and it's really almost hard to imagine the impact on our own health and our healthcare system that prohibition has. We don't have something to compare it to, right? We've grown up in this military-industrial complex. That's all we have. That's all we've come to know. We may have dreams of a sort of utopian world that didn't behave the way our current governments and the Fortune 500 companies do, but we don't have that to see. All we have is this distorted, well, maybe not distorted, but in my vision, dysfunctional society that has been taken over by, again, the military-industrial complex. So in order to discuss some of the healthcare impacts, I guess I'm going to try and compare the current system to what you might call an ideal of agricultural artist sort of model if we were to live in that lifestyle. And let's say 100 years ago, when prohibition started to take, I guess, its second step. Let's just say, like, you know, 100 years ago, we, instead of going towards a military-industrial society, we went towards this agricultural, artistic sort of community. And prohibition goes back a lot farther than that, right? We've talked the history of prohibition in some of our lectures, and certainly the history of prohibition goes back thousands of years. And it's important to put in context here in terms of the health impacts of prohibition, because before a couple thousand years ago, pretty much everybody could choose what medicines they used when they didn't feel good. Or in some ways they could choose certain drugs that they use, or certain religions that they would worship, that would use magic mushrooms or ayahuasca. People didn't have the choices we had today, right? So if you grew up in South America, there'd be just like 2 or 3 plants that you could use. Some of them would be relatively mild, some of them would kick your ass, and pretty much everywhere in the world would have some form of magic mushroom available to them too, if not more than one, right? So, there's lots that shamans would have experimented with in different rituals and routines. Some of them in larger communities would have become really intricate, like when you got tens of thousands of people and communities of religious leaders, right? They would have really developed some of these healing methods, cooking roots up and making stuff out of them and all these different potions and stuff. So you might not have had, choice in a sense of where we are today. We're going, we'll have ginseng or echinacea and everything available. But you weren't being prohibited by certain things because of, the government force. You might be persuaded into using certain things because of certain religious beliefs, because thousands of years ago we depended more on our religious beliefs than our scientific beliefs. But anyway, let's say 100 years ago we didn't go towards this military-industrial complex and just imagine this other world. The changes or the impacts of not having a pharmacy and having a herbalist to go to, for example, are huge and dramatic. And I not only believe quite strongly that we would be healthier for using all of these different herbs, and goodness knows what we would have learned in the last 100 years if we would have continued to develop this wide range of different herbs that could have been used either individually or in combination for different medical problems. Because one of the biggest impacts of Prohibition has been the development of the pharmaceutical company and the amount of drugs that people are using. I think that there's been a really negative impact upon people that are using sleeping pills or pills for anxiety or pills for headaches. There's pills for everything under the sun, and a few that were invented or made up because of the side effects of the pills. So there's just the development of the pharmaceutical company, I believe, has been solely because of Prohibition. I don't think we would have had the development of the patenting processes and all the costs incurred with the amount we're spending on prescription drugs if we had Prohibition. People would be growing their own medicine in their backyard. I've only smoked opium once. I'll never do it again unless I'm like really in a lot of pain, because it was so overwhelming that, and I've got a pretty addictive personality. If I did it again, I'd want to do it every day. But man, I tell you, if I had a back problem and if I was in a car accident and going around in a wheelchair or something like that, I could see where a small amount of opium would be a lot healthier to use than taking morphine or Dilaudid every day. Not that I wouldn't try cookies first, but I think that I deserve the fundamental choice between what I use and what I don't use. And one of the problems of Prohibition is that we've not only lost our sort of dignity, that we can't choose our course of medical treatment, but we're in a position where we've got this parental body over us that's telling us what is good and what isn't. Well, I think we could make proper decisions. I don't think that the government has either the moral authority or the science to back up their control over what we use and what we don't. And so I think we would have a much healthier society if the pharmaceutical company hadn't been developed, and if we would have developed a sort of agricultural herbal remedy industry that would be certainly on one hand employing a lot more people, because we would have herbalists growing our medicines in every small town, right? We wouldn't be relying on these large multinational companies that can control to a great extent the prices of medicine, the ability to access medicines. There's a whole bunch of drugs right now that apparently aren't on the market so much because drug companies just simply aren't keeping up with the demand at times, and really the cost of drugs right now is the single largest increasing sort of percentage-wise in the budgets for the healthcare system. It's just, eating up our healthcare budgets. And the other thing that comes with prohibition and this control that's been given over to the medical system, right? Because that's what, prohibition came in on, was like, we're going to control your health, right? Because that's what people use drugs for, essentially. It's not something that is used for anything other than ingestion, and people are, choosing to use drugs for their own health. Whether it's, good for them or not, depends often on the quality of the drugs. But doctors, through prohibition, have been given this control, not only, I believe, for what drugs are being used, but even what medical practices are occurring, and even with end-of-life care. Like right now, drug companies are making billions of dollars a day in Canada and the US feeding drugs to people who would rather be, passed on, and because we don't have the choice of when care is taken away, and euthanasia is not legal here. There's a lot of people that are kept in hospitals and being fed drugs much longer than they or their families would choose to do so. And I think that's sort of one of the side issues that comes with our loss of choice of health care and what medical practices we use. And doctors have gotten control, and pharmaceutical and drug companies have very much helped them to do that. And they've really helped frame the use of plant-based medicines to physicians as being something that's either crude or not potent enough, or somehow being a narcotic, when if it's refined and put into a pill, well, that's a medicine. And they've been grilled, really, I think, into thinking that synthetic, refined, concentrated chemicals that are sold in pill form are healthier to use than natural plants, naturally forming chemical structures, like THC. And in the plants, most often there will be combinations of chemicals that would help the body digest and use them. And these pills, don't have them. And so there's been a problem on one hand where doctors haven't had the right information about plants and their derivatives, and as such they haven't been able to give the best health care to their patients. And there's been this barrier between patients that choose to use non-prescriptive drugs. We are often almost outcast from doctors' offices upon admitting that we use illegal substances. And people's course of medical treatment can be impacted quite a bit with acknowledging even the simple use of cannabis, let alone using hard drugs. If you admit to someone in the medical community you use hard drugs, you get a label on your file, it will get transferred to every single file they can figure out. And whether it's dealing with your social worker and your children, or criminal law, or other individuals, it just seems like the label of being a drug user, sticks with people for a very long time, and that stigma is very damaging to people in ways that I think are completely unnecessary. And so people's health care is dramatically impacted because often people aren't honest with their doctors. They don't tell their doctors what they're doing or what they're not. And in some cases, rightly so, because the doctors would be so judgmental and would dismiss people at treatment. In many cases, I've heard of them doing so. Not all. There's some very open-minded, very progressive doctors, more in large cities than in small. But certainly, I don't mean to dismantle or bash the entire medical community. There are some pretty aware doctors, but for the most part, they treat people that use cannabis as narcotic users. They put it in the same category almost as alcohol, to say that well, chronic pain is going to be helped with drinking beer just as much as smoking a joint. Like, they don't know the underlying benefits that cannabis has, or inflammation, antibiotic tendencies, all these other things are quite unknown to them. They haven't been taught any of that. As far as they know, cannabis is just a painkiller, in essence, to them the same as cocaine or sorry, opium, I should say. So the impact on our health and our healthcare systems, I would suggest, are really, in some ways, the most fundamental in terms of all of these overlapping problems. Because on one hand, we're not getting proper health care, right? Like, the most important thing to us is our bodies and our health. And we rely really heavily upon the medical profession to have the best possible treatments, the best possible options. And to think that this huge area of options has been cut off from us is, to me, completely absurd, unrealistic, and goes against what everything the healthcare system should be doing. They should be looking at all our options. They should be, if they're going to prescribe narcotics, if they're going to put people through surgeries and tell them they got a 50% chance of living, well, they should have some herbal remedies that are options to say, oh, okay, well, you got a 50% chance of living through this surgery, or we could give you these pot cookies and smoked joints, and it might have these side effects, but people should have these sorts of options available to them. They shouldn't be just cut off from the doctor before the physician even has a chance. You're trying to mic me here?
Yeah, my mic weird.
Yeah, that's okay. I could just do it all over again.
Yeah,
okay. So to me, while again, there is a vast number of areas, the most important and fundamental problem that prohibition causes is the effect that it has on our own individual health. And so, and from that, again, just our healthcare system, which should be there to help the sick and dying, let alone, healthy people dealing with, life's problems. And so, I think if we just looked at the economic and social impact of the healthcare system, it would be easy to conclude that we need a different policy. However, these policies weren't created because of any healthcare problems or social problems. It was economic opportunities, as we well know. But I guess there's other areas as well that I'd like to touch on. I think that brought up most of the healthcare impacts, but I'm reminded of the impacts on the family, which can't be underestimated, because the prohibition of drugs filters through into any home that is raising children. I've chosen not to do that, so I'm, in a sense, sidestepping these issues in my own personal life. But anyone that has children can't avoid the issues of drugs, whether you're a drug user or not, right? Non-drug users who might not, have a problem with drug use, but just don't want to do anything illegal, I think would have a hard time, telling their young children and teenagers straight in the face, if they're being honest, that cannabis is going to lead you to harder drugs or to a life of crime. That's just simply not the case, and any reasonable adult would know that one of the worst things that you can do is lie to your kids. And your kids these days, they have access to the internet. They can see the world around them much more than I could when I was a teenager, I'll tell you that. And so they're quite aware that people have been smoking pot since the 60s. In fact, people are now smoking it with Health Canada cards, and it's not making the population go crazy or causing any of the big problems that we were led to believe they would. And so while the state might go into class and tell children a bunch of horrendous things about drugs and include cannabis in that, kids aren't going to buy it, and they're going to come home and they're going to question their parents about what they've been told in school. And in particular, because they'll see this contrast between what they're being told and what they see, right? Because, and I went through it myself as a teenager in Ontario, right? It's like, okay, I'm being told that drugs are bad, but gee, all the cool people, all the older people are into drugs. It's this big part of our culture. It's joked about by Snoop Dogg or like, people in the entertainment industry. Like we got Charlie Sheen now going on about cocaine use. Well, Charlie Sheen's not in an alley. Charlie Sheen's got millions of dollars, probably making millions more every day he's on TV right now, right? Like these are through Hollywood, really, unfortunate but very real examples where young people can see that drugs are very prevalent in the communities, and so they're going to question adults and their parents in particular about what is going on here. And if parents are dishonest and don't tell them that they've used pot when they did or whatever, kids are going to see through that very quickly. I know I sure did, and questioned my parents and discovered that I was being misled by the authority. And I think that is one of the worst things that we can do, is put our young people in a position where they have to choose who to believe, whether it's their parents, whether it's their friends, whether it's the government. And if they're getting conflicting information about what I believe is the most critical part of our lives, which is our own health and our own body, they're going to start making, I think, potentially rash decisions and starting to experiment in ways that they might not, and start to distrust other authorities. And suddenly it might be that their friends in the street community are more honest with them than their parents or their schools, which might not be the best case when you're a young teenager. And so I think that the policy of prohibition is the first divider between youth and their parents, or it could be. A lot of parents in this day and age are quite open and honest, and they'll tell their kids, yeah, I used pot, or I still use pot, it's not that big a deal. They're really confused about it, I know, and it doesn't make sense to you, I'm sure, right now, why it's happening, but it causes a lot of conflicts, whether it's just parents that use or did use drugs, or in some cases are growing cannabis or have medical issues and use it for medical problems. And so kids are being told that cannabis has no medical value by the police in their schools these days, and then they're coming home and, well, grandpa's got a medical marijuana card. So it's really something that the conflicting information has a significant impact on young people's trust of the government, of their parents, and their almost encouragement to not only experiment, but as I've said before, I've got in depth in some other lectures about this being the first way most young people get into making good money. Like, I was selling hash at a very young age myself, 16. I was 25 years being a drug dealer these days. It's something that I'm not the only one that's made a career out of it from high school. It's something that one of the first things many young people realize is that if you want to make quick cash that your parents don't find out about, that you don't have to put down on paper, and if you like smoking a gram of hash on the weekend, well, there's no better way to sell 6 grams to your buddies and subsidize your habit. So it's one of the first industries that young people get into that can draw them into all sorts of other criminal activities, and starting to think and act more like a deviant. And if they didn't have that opportunity, if the plants and were being sold in licensed facilities for adults and stuff, and kids are being told, no, just wait, it'll be better for you, better for your health, be able to party your ass off when you're 18 or 19, but it's better for you. And it is in most cases. When you look it up, like maybe with pot, it's even at 16 it's not so bad, but making them wait till 18 wouldn't hurt so much either, and it would give them a chance to go through school and really get grounded in their lives. And it's very reasonable to ask for something like that. But
physically or endocannabinoid system is fully matured by then too. So.
yeah. So, but you know, either way, the prohibition of drugs almost encourages young people to experiment at a younger age instead of encouraging them to wait until they're old enough that they're physically and mentally mature enough to use it in the healthiest way possible. Anyway, like I say, the social impact of prohibition is vast and enormous. Maybe next year I'll focus on the politics, but I really wanted to focus on the health part here. Thanks everybody for coming out. Have a great day. And again, we've got the other lecture here starting at 4:30. It's in the Student Union building, apparently the Michael Pajol room. There's a harm reduction teach-in at 4:30 over there, so we're going to drag a bunch over from 420. Thanks everybody for coming out. Have a great day.